In this detail example, we're going to use Excel to create a univariate statistics table using data from a random sample of 20 cases from the 2012 General Social Survey. So notice that we have 20 cases here, 1 through 20, and we have several different variables, including ID, education, father's degree, father's education, the respondent's race, class, sex, happiness, health, abortion attitude, and word sum. And so we can begin basically by sorting our data. So if we highlight our data and we go to Data, Sort, we can sort the data by the variable that we're going to use as the basis for our table, in this case education. So we're going to put education where it says sorted by, and it's going to sort it from smallest to largest. So we'll click OK, and notice that it sorted the data. Now sorting the data basically means that the order of the records are changed, although the relationships among the variables within the records are still the same. In other words, if you look across every one of these rows, each of the rows has the same information that they had previously. They're just in a different order. And so we can simplify things by basically only looking at those variables that we're most interested in this case education. So what we could do is we could basically just hide the rest of the variables. And we accomplish this by clicking somewhere within the heading of each of the columns. And if we hit Control and hold it down, we can continue clicking. And then if we right click, one of the options that we have is to hide the information. So we'll click Hide, and that'll hide every one of the columns except the one that we want to work with. Okay, so now that we've sorted the data and we've hid the variables that we don't want, let's go ahead and create our univariate table. And so we can start by basically looking at the different categories of the variable and listing them. And so notice that we have different categories of education ranging from 10 years of education to 19 years of education that take on values in between, like 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, and 18 years of education. And so basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to write down all the distinct categories of education from 10 to 19. So here I got 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, and 19. And now that I've sorted the data by education, I can basically go through and look to see how many cases are in each category of the variable. It's very easy to see this in this sort order. Notice that the data are sorted from the lowest values of education to the highest values of education. So let's start with 10. We can see that there's only one case that has 10 years of education. Therefore, we put a 1 here, and this is going to be our frequency. And so how many cases have 11 years of education? Well, it's these 2, and so this gets a value of 2. How many cases have 12 years of education? Well, it's these 5, and so this value gets a value of 5. How many have 13? Well, it's these 2, and so 13 gets 2. How many have 14? Well, it's these 2. So again, 14 gets 2. How many have 15? Well, there's only 1 with 15, so this gets a value of 1. There's only 1 with 16. Notice that there's 4 with 17. And then there's 1 with 18 and 1 with 19. And so we basically just counted how many cases fall into each category of the variable. And so now if we take the sum of this column, we should get our total number of cases, which in this case is 20. And so we can do that very easily in Excel by using Excel's built-in functions. And so for example, if you put an equal sign and you use the sum function, it'll take the sum of a string of numbers. And so if we just go up to the next highest cell and we hold down the Shift key and we scroll all the way up to the last cell that we want to include in this summation, and we close our parentheses and hit return or enter, it'll give us the sum, in this case 20 cases. So now that we've calculated the frequency for each case and we have our frequency distribution, next we can create a percent distribution. And so we do that basically by taking each of these values, each index by some letter and some number, in this case N4, and dividing it by the total number of cases, which is in cell N14. And so basically we take this cell, by putting an equal sign, we take this cell, divide it by this cell, and then we multiply it by 100 to get the percent. Now, we want to do these same calculations for each category of the variable education. And so basically what we could do is we could take our cursor and put it on this little square at the lower right-hand corner of this focal cell and just drag it down. The problem is Excel will want to use a different cell referenced for the total number of cases. So we have to somehow fix that quantity so that Excel knows to use this repeatedly in the calculation. All of the other cells will dynamically change values. And so we can do that basically by putting a $ in between the N and the 14. Doing so basically tells Excel that we want to continue to use cell N14 when we're doing these calculations. Each of these other cells, for example N4, will become different values like N5, N6, N7, and so on. And so we can just kind of drag this down by clicking in that corner and dragging. And notice that it gives us the percentages for each category. And then again, if we take the sum, that's going to give us 100%, which is the sum of the total percents. Okay, now that we've done that, let's create a cumulative frequency. And the cumulative frequency is basically found by taking a running total. And so for the first category, 10 years of education, we're just going to carry over the first frequency. So there's one person with 10 years of education. What about 11 years of education? Well, we're just going to add the frequency of that category to the one before it. That is the people who have 10 years of education. And so we'll use an equal sign, and we'll add this value to this value. And that gives us 3 people. So we see here that 3 people have 11 years of education or less. How do we get it for 12? Well, it's the same thing. 3 plus the 5 people who have 12 years of education gives us 8. For the next category, we take 8 and we add 2. That gives us 10. And so on. We keep doing this. So 10 plus 2 gives us 12. 12 plus 2, or 1, gives us 13. 13 plus 1 gives us 14. 14 plus 4 gives us 18. 18 plus 1 gives us 19. And then 19 plus 1 should give us 20 cases. And so notice that the last category for the cumulative frequency has the same value as the total number of cases. So these two values should be the same. We can also calculate the cumulative percent. And we do that the same way. We just keep a running total. So for the first category, 10 years of education, we just carry that over. And now we keep a running total. So how many people, what percent have 11 or fewer years of education? Well, we're going to take this value and add the percent of the next highest category, which is 10. And so 5 plus 10 is going to give us 15. Then we add the next one. So 15 plus 25 is going to give us 40. 40 plus 10 gives us 50. 50 plus 10 gives us 60. And so on. We're going to do this until we've done all the categories. So we're basically just figuring out what the total is going to look like if we just keep adding the categories until we run out. And as you might guess, when we get to our last category, we should have 100%, which should match the value that we had here. Okay, so now we have almost the entire remnants of the table. There's probably a few things that we should add to this table to make it look just a little bit nicer. For one thing, it's good to add an indication that these are totals. Also notice that this cell content is actually going beyond the limit of this cell. Well, we can actually fix that. If you put your cursor right between these cells and you double click, it'll size the cell so that the entire contents are within that cell. Another thing we can do is we can change the alignment. And so if we go up here to Home and we click this middle alignment, it'll center align everything. Another thing that we have to add is some kind of a title and a source. And so let's say that we wanted a title that spans the entire length of this table. Well, what I like to do is I like to merge the cells. So we go up here to Merge and Center, and we hit Merge Across, and then we can just type in our title contents. So I'm going to call this Table 1 Univariate Statistics for Education. And then I need some kind of a source information. So again, I'm going to take these and I'm going to merge them across, and I'm going to put in my source information. So I'm going to type in source GSS 2012. And then one sort of last finishing touch that I like to add is some horizontal lines just to make the table look a little bit nicer. And so what you do here is basically highlight the cells on which you want to create a border, And there's a little tool here that you can click that allows you to put in borders. And so pull that down, go to the last value that says more borders. And we're going to add a top border and a bottom border. And we'll click OK. And there we go. And so now we're basically ready to interpret the results of this table. And so what can we tell based on this pattern? Well, first of all, notice that a lot of the largest percentages of frequencies happen to be kind of at the left tail of the distribution, lower values of education. So in this sample, there are more people with like lower education levels than higher education levels. You can see here that these are a little bit more sparse, well, maybe with the exception of 17 years of education. In terms of the most commonly occurring category, that's 12, because 5 out of the 20 people, or 25% of the distribution, has 12 years of education. The next highest is 17, with 4 out of the 20 people, or 20%, having 17 years of education. We can also tell something about the span of the data. So here we can see that the data span from 10 years of education to 19 years of education, so that's a fairly wide range. We can also say something about the relative position of some of these different categories from the cumulative frequency and the cumulative percents. So for example, we can see here that 14 people have 16 years of education or less. We can also see here that 60% of people have 14 years of education and less. And so we can tell a variety of different things from just a simple univariate table like this one. Once we've made this table, we can actually take this and copy and paste it into a Word document. So if I just hit Control-C to copy it, I go to my Word document, Control-V to paste, we've got a pretty nice looking table. And so generally this is sort of a first step in analysis. We're going to look at how to use more complex types of statistics in future detailed examples. Okay, in this portion of the example, we're going to look at how to use SPSS to create a frequency distribution. And let's start by bringing in our data. So if we go to the File pull-down menu, and we go to Open Data, we can just find our data set, which I'm putting in a folder called GSS. So I'm going to bring in my 2012 GSS data. So again, notice that I have all of my variables here, all of my records. And if I want to create a frequency distribution, let's say I wanted to do it for the variable education, I would just go to the Analyze pull-down menu, go to Descriptive Statistics, and then Frequencies. And then I just have to find my variable. I can just type in educ, highlight it, move it over to this box using this little arrow. And I have to make sure that this little check mark next to Display Frequency Tables is marked. If it's not marked, SPSS is not going to create a frequency table. So make sure that there's a check mark in this box. And we'll click OK. And in short order, SPSS creates our output statistics. And so we can start with basically a summary of the number of cases that are used in the analysis. So we see that we have 1,972 valid cases. Valid cases basically means that there's no missing data, and that's our N, our number of cases. And then we have 2 missing cases. And so down here, this is our actual univariate table. And so you can see that these are the values of education, and it goes from 0 all the way down to 20 years of education. Then we also have some that are missing because they don't know or they're not applicable, for a total of 2 missing cases. The grand total is 1,974. And in these different columns, SPSS has the frequency distribution, the percent distribution, the valid percent distribution, and the cumulative percent distribution. So what is the difference between percent and valid percent? Well, valid percent basically takes into account only those cases that are non-missing. And so percent uses in its denominator both the missing cases and the non-missing cases. Valid percent only looks at those cases that are non-missing. And so when we're looking at percentages, really what we care about is the valid percent rather than the percent. And so how do we read these? Well, first of all, let's look at those people who have 0 years of education. And so there's 3 people in the data set out of the 1,970 some that we have included. And they make up about 0.2%. Okay, they also make up a cumulative percent that's the same as their valid percent, right? And so cumulative percent, remember, is just a running total. It tells us the relative position of a particular value of the variable in the distribution. And so let's see if we can see some patterns. So first of all, we can see that there's quite a wide range in education. So the low value is 0. The high value is 20. It looks like there are more cases that have high levels of education rather than low levels of education. So as a group, this is a fairly educated sample. We can see that if we look at the cumulative percent column, the midpoint is about 13 years of education. We can see some evidence of some peaks in the data. So we see that there's like 540 cases that have 12 years of education. That seems to be a peak because it's much higher than 11, much higher than 13. There looks like another peak at 14 years, another peak at 16 years. Looks like a slightly smaller peak at 18 years. These probably correspond to terminal degrees like high school, associate's degree, college degree, master's degree, and so on. And so there's a number of different patterns that we can find by looking at the data. And so this is basically a good starting point for analysis. And so we can very easily create a frequency table in SPSS, and we can use that as the basis for some of the first statistics that we're going to do when we're looking at some kind of a research project.